considered federal election activity, even if they do not refer to federal candidates in the communications. And so that is the piece that ends up being, I think, frustrating to some of the state or local parties or caucuses that say, look, we're actually only interested here in the state races, but the FEC rules say that if you are within the window and you are either a party committee or a caucus and you're spending dollars on those activities, we are going to treat them as federal, regardless of the absence or presence of or regardless of the absence of a mention of a federal candidate.
Supervisor Schneider.
Thank you. So I think kind of in hand with that, I know in our locality, we do joint literature. And so is that going to then be disallowed on a federal or like on a federal election years then? Because we usually our committee sends out a piece that has all of the elected or the people that will be on the ballot on one piece of mail to all of our constituents so that they can take that with them to the voting polls. So I think that's sounding like we couldn't do that anymore.
You would be able to do it, but you would have to, if you are a local party committee, there are two issues. One is you would have to use, if you are also promoting a federal candidate as part of that sample ballot or slate card or piece, you would have to use federal funds for that activity. And in addition, if you spend above a certain threshold advocating for federal candidates, you will trigger the need to establish a federal account. And so what happens in a lot of states is that local party committees don't want to go through the compliance process of having to register with the FEC. And so they sort of arrange with the state party that the state party sends out those types of communications under the state party label. And that way that sort of avoids the need for the local parties to do it. But obviously there is some loss there, right? The local parties want to do it. It's a way to get their folks involved. There may be more trust between the voters and the local party committees. Getting the state party to do it may be hard when they're focused on other stuff. So it is sort of a source of, it's doable, but is often sort of a source of frustration.
Delegate Homer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I just asked I'd ask the witness. We've been talking a little bit about the challenges we would face at the state level. I also think that the current gap does create some loopholes and transparency, and I just want to make sure I understand it. My understanding right now is if you're a federal super PAC that donates in Virginia, receives donations that may end up supporting a candidate, you're not actually regulated by the large donations cap. So right now, if a party committee or the caucus or whatever receives over a certain amount in Virginia, that's a 24-hour reporting threshold. That doesn't exist for federal super PACs. Federal super PACs, because the Virginia law, can spend on an unlimited basis, and the reporting for federal super PACs in what Virginia would consider an off year or on year, which is an off year for the rest of the country for federal elections, is such that you have a July 31st report and then a January report. So you can't actually witness the expenditures that take place at a state level. I assume that if we shifted over to even year elections, federal super PAC expenditures would then align with our candidate timelines. Is my understanding right? Is essentially in the 45 other states that if federal super PACs are spending in state races, you would see those concomitant with a reporting period that's meant to align with election cycles.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think there are sort of two issues there. The first is that Virginia allows federal PACs to make contributions in state elections simply by registering one-time registration with elect. And once you do that, there's no additional reporting in Virginia by those federal PACs. The only reporting goes to the Federal Election Commission. So if you move to, which is obviously that is, a legislative choice. If you move to an even year election cycle, the federal super PAC schedule changes. They then report on a quarterly basis, not a semi-annual basis, plus with an additional pre-election report and an additional post-election report. And so you would have a circumstance in which federal super PACs are then reporting, at least filing a report 12 days before the general election, covering all activity through the 20th day before the election. So it would include more activity than you currently have under the current set of rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Lucas Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Barkin, thank you for the presentation. My question is, you made mention to 5 states, I believe, who are under the federal elections. And the question is it a desire or any urgency for any of these states to be aligned, whether they're red state, blue state, battleground states, for them to be under the even election years or any other circumstance? So just wanted to know, I know you made mention of the 5 states that are currently under the federal election, so just was wondering if there's any urgency for them to align together or in opposition of each other.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have not heard anything from any of those states that there's any effort afoot legislatively or via their constitutional process to move their elections to an even year, but there may be it, and maybe I just haven't heard of it. So in my 15 years doing this, I have not seen any state change their elections from odd to even or even to odd. But I am sure that there's always some discussion of it for the same reason that there is here.
John, I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and then we're going to let you go and get Chris up here. Thank you for your time, by the way.
Of course.
My first question is kind of a comparative one. So, right, some states have more lenient campaign finance laws than the feds do, and then some have stricter, right? So if you think of I think Montana might be an example of that. Do we see is there and Chris, maybe this is for you too when you come up, is there a noticeable difference between how those types of states interface with the federal government, with the federal candidates? So Montana, where it's easier to raise in the federal election than a state election, as opposed to, I don't know, Virginia, right? If we were to make a move. Do we see a fundamental difference in how elections are run in those 2 different scenarios, or do they end up kind of getting to a similar place functionally?
It's a great question. I think at some level, and I think Chris will agree, there is a desire among all those who participate in the political process to figure out ways to raise and spend money as efficiently and as effectively as possible. And so in states where the state law is more lenient than federal law, which is the vast majority, to be clear, Virginia is obviously on one side of it. But there are, really only a handful of states where I would say it's stricter than federal law. So in the Virginias of the world, there is an effort to try to categorize activity as much as legally possible as being outside of the federal rules. And in states where the state law is stricter, there is an effort to try to categorize as much as possible as being preempted by federal rules. So there does end up being sort of that dynamic in both places.
My second question is, one thing Delegate Helmer kind of got to this a little bit, but not maybe in the way I'm going to ask it, is how does super PACs change all of this? And I guess what I'm getting at is, maybe 10 years ago, you see a world if we were consolidating, people just being like, man, Virginia has no limits. We're going to shovel as much money as we can to Senator Van Valkenburg, because then Senator Van Valkenburg can spend all this unlimited money on field in Western Henrico County or on whatever in Western Henrico County, and that'll goose turnout. Whereas now you're in a world where, I mean, they can't coordinate technically, but we're in a world where we have entire campaigns outsourcing their field program to super PACs. How does that, has that changed anything at the states in the last 5 or so years, or has it not changed anything? Like, how has that impacted this interaction?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I think goes back to when the beginning of my presentation, when we look back at McCain-Feingold and think it is quaint, the idea that the way in which you would, get around federal campaign finance laws to give money to state Senate candidates, and that was the concern back then because super PACs didn't exist. That would be the way to essentially get as much money into the system as possible. We really have not seen that in recent years because of the presence of super PACs. I think now, just given the the presence and kind of permanence of those super PACs, to the extent that there is a desire to give money in excess of federal limits to influence federal campaigns, that money tends to flow through super PACs. And obviously to some extent also 501c organization. So I don't think we would see a circumstance in which there would be efforts to give more money to to state candidates to do that kind of work. I think in general, because they're used to it, that money would probably still flow to super PACs.
And my last question is kind of if let's say we make the move, how I guess kind of game out how you think the state elections would change, like game out the how would raising money, how would creating coordinateds, how would, I guess, just like kind of take some of this legalese and this theory and like make it concrete. And I'm not holding you to anything you say because obviously I'm asking you to wing what you think would happen. But like what functionally do you think we would see change?
So I think the first thing that we would see is that groups on both sides that you as candidates are used to working with, the sort of, the kind of interest groups on both sides, but also sort of, any ideological organizations, et cetera, they would move largely to the independent side in those years because they would want the flexibility to spend money in federal races. That would certainly be true, I think, in presidential years and probably true also in the midterm years. So I think that's the first thing you would see. The second thing you would see is that there becomes a significantly, to the point Senator Servo was making, there becomes a demand for federal money because you actually need a certain minimum of federal dollars in order to run the coordinated campaign. And in years where there is a very competitive presidential or Senate race, that money largely flows through DNC, RNC, DSCC, NRSC, et cetera. Obviously, in competitive congressional districts that we have in Virginia, that'll flow through NRCC, DCCC. But I think you would see a really heightened demand for federal dollars that does not exist right now. So to me, those would end up being the two biggest finance changes that we would end up seeing in the race in these years.
Cool. And we're going to give Senator Servo the last question, and then we're going to move on.
Three things I could see as being practical consequences, and I'm just curious for your reaction. One is, I think it's going to be a lot harder for us to hire staff because right now everybody comes to Virginia because nothing else is going on. So it's a lot easier for us to get managers, field, finance, whatever, all from all over the country because there's nothing else happening. So people come here to work, consultants, whatever. I think there'll be an impact on that. Secondly, I would like to know whether you think there would be more pressure on elected officials to rely more on raising money from individuals, small donors, than there is right now. Because right now, for example, in Virginia, because you don't have to worry about showing that you have hard dollars in your account as a candidate or as a party, perhaps it's easier to raise money from larger sources, whether they're corporations, PACs, or individuals that will write checks in excess of $3,500. So it seems to me there'd be more pressure on elected officials to try to raise their money from humans in smaller amounts so that we can account for this stuff and it simplifies our compliance and reporting obligations. And to me, that would be a good thing. And then the third thing, practical impact that I wonder about is whether or not you think there would be less pressure on state elected officials to actually raise money, because it would be possible for state legislative and local candidates to rely on either the presidential, U.S. Senate, or congressional field operation and campaign whatever they've got going on over there, so that we wouldn't need to raise as much, because we can have to reinvent the wheel every year when we're in this off-year thing. So I'm just curious whether you think there would be, notwithstanding all the coordination issues and everything else, whether there'd be less of a need for state and local people to raise money.
Yeah. So the first point, I completely agree with you. I mean, Virginia is the center of the political universe every odd year, because it is, I think of the 5 states you mentioned, it is the purplish, most purple of those 5. It's, obviously its proximity to Washington, D.C. and a lot of the political folks that live there. So you do have a ton of attention on your elections in the odd year that you just will not have in the even year. The focus in 2023 on legislative races that were in Virginia, that is rare to see in other states around the country. So I do think that would change, just because you blend into a much larger mix of elections. I also agree that it would increase the need to raise hard dollars from individuals, from humans. On the last point, I think in theory, yes, like if there is a lot of federal interest in the race, there will be more money in from the feds to help finance the coordinated campaign. I think what many of your colleagues in other states would say is that the struggle then becomes to convince those federally focused campaigns to even include us on the list, to include us in the coordinated campaign. And so I think that ends up becoming the struggle, is that it's sort of more federally focused, and therefore it becomes a political discussion about the extent to which the federal candidates will work with the legislative candidates in that year.
Thanks.
Of course.
John, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. It was really helpful. Next up, we have Chris Marston.
You.
And so, Chris, same thing. Just kind of introduce who you are, give us an overview, and then we'll ask you some questions.
Good morning. Thank you, Senator. It's a pleasure to be here with all the members. I am a volunteer as the general counsel for the Republican Party of Virginia, so I have some experience in state party finances. And in my day job, I run a compliance firm that does campaign finance reporting for both federal and state candidates. So I have some practical experience as well. There are 3 areas that I wanted to discuss with you. The first is sort of the reporting schedule. The second, John covered very well in regards the allocation between state and federal funds. And the third is advertising disclosures and disclaimers. I did prepare a handout. The first one that you see up on the screen is my sort of hypothetical combined 2028 election. And I just put this together to show you what campaign reporting would look like in terms of when reports went in and who had different reporting requirements. And with the exception of the first quarter, covering January 1 to March 31, there is no report that would be in common between state PACs, federal PACs, state candidates, and federal PACs. Whether that leads you to think perhaps you should make a change to the schedule, certainly up to you. But I think there are 2 things. There's and this, of course, is good for me. There's an increased need for compliance professionals, but there's also a challenge in the public disclosure world. I think that some have alluded to that with the issue of sort of what I'd call the super PAC loophole in odd years with reporting. This isn't as big a loophole as it were, but it just, everybody's on a different schedule. So when the gubernatorial campaign says, we raised this much, it's going to be, 4 days after the Senate campaign raised this much, and they're not comparable time periods. So again, that's not necessarily bad, but it is something you might want to consider if you make that change. So that was really the big point on finance. The other thing I would note is there are a lot of rules that are different with regards to what gets reported and how things are categorized. The federal rules tend to be more complicated. The Virginia rules are more simple, but it makes apples to apples comparisons harder when you're looking at these things. Again, I'm not sure that's necessarily bad. It's just something to be aware of. With regard to the allocation between state and federal, there's a second handout there that doesn't do nearly as good a job as John did on breaking out the allocation of federal and non-federal funds. The point I wanted to make with this fairly ludicrous chart is that it's super confusing and complicated, and it changes from year to year, even in federal cycles. As an example, your administrative cost percentage changes based on whether there's a president, a senate, or just House members on the ballot. So there's 3 different percentage allocations in those different years. And there's complicated rules for different types of communications, and which you base on time and space dedicated to federal and state candidates, and which have to be all federal because they include, the attack, support, or oppose. So the point is it's just very complicated. So I think one of the things I draw from that is, much like McCain-Feingold now seems quaint, you really never know what consequences there's going to come from changes you make in these systems until you've made them, and strange things emerge. So, for example, the most recent in the federal sphere is we have this crazy combined candidate super PAC advertising, where you can do half the ad financed by a candidate and the other half by a super PAC that comes out of the NRCC, or this new thing where you use a joint fundraising committee at the federal level. As long as you ask for money at the end, you can pay for your ads out of a joint fundraising committee that has lots of money coming in from sources other than the candidate committee. So those things will just emerge. John and I get paid to come up with crazy theories like that will comply with the law and allow people to spend money more efficiently. It's hard to know what the impact will be, and it's very hard when you consider it from the perspective of a single entity. So, Delegate Helmer, you focused a lot on what a caucus would do and what the implication is for a state candidate, and that's entirely appropriate for you. But you have to also ask the question, what does a state party do? How does it change its behavior? The coordinated campaign is a great example. Someone raised the mail permit, which is another great example. But if you're using the mail permit and you're just advocating for a state campaign, super, you're covered. But if there's any reference to a federal candidate, federal election activity. And as you all know, some years in Virginia, campaigns tend to be nationalized. We talk about national issues and national policymakers and say things about bad stuff in Washington. If we mention a federal candidate in doing that, changes the rules. So there's just a whole lot of detail, and it really is difficult to know exactly what the implications will be. The final point I wanted to discuss is advertising disclosure rules. This is another area where there are differences in the rules at state and federal level, and one challenge that presents both to everyone who's trying to comply, the consulting firms that prepare your ads, and also to the public to understand what's allowed and not allowed. And when, oh my goodness, the number of people who complain about some advertising rule and demand that the state party stop doing something, they're almost always wrong because they're in the wrong year. And the number of candidates, who last year forgot to put the black box around their disclaimer because that was a new state rule, it's just a challenge with differences between rules. I actually commend the General Assembly for sort of standardizing the printed box disclaimer. That made life a lot easier for all of us. But there's a lot of differences still in TV and radio and phone calls. As an example, the stand by your ad provision we have in Virginia only requires you to stand by your ad if you mention another clearly identified candidate. At the federal level, you have to stand behind all your ads. I don't mean to disparage anyone's courage. I'm not trying to say that. Just that there are different rules for the TV and radio. On telephone calls and text messages, the federal rules only kick in if you make 500 or more. The state rules don't apply unless you're within 180 days of a general or 90 days of a primary, and then they're for every call. Printed communications, this is where you have standardized the visual disclaimer, which I think is great. But at the federal level, it applies only to public communications, which is a defined term that doesn't mean what you think it means. In the state rules, it applies to any printed communication. So there are just differences in the applications. Internet communications, similarly, all internet communications are regulated in one category at the federal level. If it's on the internet, it's under these rules. Under the new state rules, if it's on the internet and it's text or graphics, it's one set of rules. If it's video or audio, it's a different set of rules. So, and the statutory exceptions to where disclaimers have to appear are also different. The federal sets out 3 criteria. The state just applies to novelty items that don't need a disclaimer. So when people are, printing pencils to give out at county fairs, and one has to have a disclaimer and the other doesn't, it just gets complicated. That's sort of a silly example, but I think you take the point. So I hope that those are helpful issues to consider as you contemplate whether or not consolidating these would be a good idea. I didn't want to get too far into the policy realm. It's yours, but I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions you might have about my presentation or anything that emerged from John's that you wanted further detail on.
Delegate Helmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, really appreciated the presentation. Going back to the second slide in there about the difference in reporting timelines for the 45 states that aren't crazy, like the 5 of us who have every year elections. Do they generally align? I can understand why our disclosures are different, and frankly, we just probably evolve faster than federal law does in positive ways. But the reporting schedule, I imagine we've just evolved organically over time for whatever reason. Do those 45 states generally align to federal reporting cycles, or are they also a mishmash of, sometimes when a governor reports their quarterly fundraising, it's actually a quarter, and sometimes it's a month or whatever it is?
I wouldn't be comfortable making a complete generalization. I'd say it's probably mixed about 50-50 with states that decided, let's just use the same schedule, and states that have their own schedule.
And Mr. Chair, just follow, since you are a compliance professional and this is what you deal with, if we did go this pathway from a just disclose, do you think there are any advantages to not being on the federal timeline, or the federal rules sufficient in achieving the goals of seeing who donates, when they donate, who they donated to allow us from a timing perspective, where if we just followed those, we would be in a good place? Or are there actually really good policy reasons to maintain a separate reporting? They're closing loopholes or something like that.
So the post-election and pre-election timelines, I think the difference between 8 days and 10 days out from the election is insignificant. It would be better to just align them. There are a few reports in Virginia that aren't at the federal level. For example, in the summer, Virginia has a July-August report due in September that the federal government doesn't have. They just do the full quarter on October 15th. How important that particular disclosure is, I'm not sure, but that would be about the only thing you would lose if you switched specifically to the federal schedule.
Delegate Price?
Thank you. I think my question is aligned to Delegate Helmer's, but with the allocation rules, when you're talking about the federal percentages, depending upon who's on the November ballot and how the different types and rules. But is this sheet what other states who are on combined schedules have to deal with? So is it just shocking to a Virginian, but it's not shocking to other folks? So is it something that we could get used to over time?
This is certainly, this is exclusively, federal, so it applies everywhere that has those combined elections now, and different states adapt to it in different ways. Some have strong parties, some have weak parties, but the same rules would apply.
Senator Servo?
Yeah. I had 2 questions. One is, I see on your reporting chart, your first one, you've got federal parties, PACs. My recollection is that, again, when I ran my committee years ago, that we reported monthly. The Fairfax County Democratic Committee reported every month to the feds. Is that right? And I guess that would be a new thing if any other local committees around the state wanted to set up federal accounts.
So technically, there's a quarterly option and a monthly option. If you participate in, if you make any expenditures that constitute federal election activity in an on year, you have to do monthly. So you might do quarterly in the off year and monthly in the on year, or if you had very limited federal activity and didn't do FEA, you could still do quarterly in the on year. That was sort of too much complexity to add. I thought 5 pounds was enough.
Okay, thanks. And then second question. I couldn't quite tell from your presentation on your advertising disclosure stuff, but do you think there'd be value in aligning any of the differences between the state and federal, or I'm trying to understand if you think there'd be a need for maybe law changes in there to make them the same so we avoid confusion and problems? And
I think it would be prudent to do that. I think to the extent citizens want to be involved in the election process and want to understand the rules and know when someone's breaking them and not, it's much easier to have one set of rules. And the same, of course, applies to the folks producing the ads and the compliance folks advising them. So if I were emperor for a day, I would certainly make them the same.
sorry, one last question.
Yep.
I know you got to watch Mr. Burkhan be in the hot seat for how long that was, and answer all these questions. Did you have any sort of alternative perspective on anything that he said as a Republican leaning, advisor as compared to what he said? I'm trying to understand if there's any partisan differences on this stuff.
With respect to the campaign finance and advertising rules, there's not a lot of difference between the parties. We both have the same incentive to adapt to whatever rules there are and create whatever efficiencies we can to maximize the power of the dollars we raise and the campaigns we run. So I don't really see that there's a partisan angle to this. Obviously, there's sometimes policy differences with regards to levels of disclosure and super PACs are good or bad. But in terms of the rule set, we both deal with the same rule set and have to adapt to it in the same way. So I really don't see any areas of disagreement I would have with John.
Okay, thanks.
Delegate Price?
Thank you. So I'm going to widen that then. So we were here 2 days ago, and we were just kind of talking about different facets of pros and cons of consolidation. So one of the things that I think was the biggest realization for me would be that federal law, just federal elections law, would kind of take over then for state and local elections. And I'm very proud of some of the laws that we have here in Virginia as far as voting rights, but then that could change because then, federal law, should there be citizenship requirements or whatever, not asking how you feel about those laws, but do you have any additional input outside of campaign finance that you would like to posit for us to consider should we be, doing the pros and cons of consolidation?
With respect to the specific issue you raise about sort of federal law trumping things, there are states that manage to maintain a distinction between state and federal elections on the same day. It's complicated and a little unpleasant. Arizona, for example, had made efforts to have a citizenship requirement. They knew they couldn't apply that to federal elections. So if you want a ballot that includes state offices, you have to prove citizenship. If you don't, you just get the federal ballot. That's complicated to administer and is a pain for election officials. But to the extent that it's important for a particular state to maintain a particular policy about some issue, it's not necessarily the case that federal law will stop you from doing something with respect to your state elections. There are certainly some requirements, but those generally already apply the National Voter Registration Act. I think there's a blackout window for removing or canceling registrations. Under federal law, it's a 90-day window. Under state law, it's a 60-day window. Whether those 30 days are changing America, I couldn't say, but that would obviously change because we'd be all federal elections at that point. So that blackout window would change. But I think that's a fairly small detail compared to some significant policy changes that you could maintain a difference on. I think you probably have an incentive not to, simply because of the complications. So that's something to consider. You'd probably be under pressure to say, no, we should have the same rules for everybody and everything. So it might be difficult to maintain a separate state policy on some things, but it's certainly something worth thinking about. I also would say with regard to the Virginia Voting Rights Act, that those requirements would remain, despite there being differences with federal law. The pre-clearance by the Attorney General, polling places, things like that. Those are all policies that would not be affected by consolidation.
Chris, so if you look at a state kind of like Virginia, but that's on an even year, and by kind of like Virginia, I essentially mean, kind of unlimited raising or such high limits that it's functionally unlimited, coordination rules, whatever. As a state like that in an even year, what do you see? I guess what's the comparison on state level spending, right? So like if you take, in Virginia in 23, I think the most expensive Senate races were like between 10 and $15 million, and the most expensive House races were probably 5 to 8, right? If you were to transplant those elections into the 22 cycle, say, rather than the 23 cycle, what does that look? Does the delta go? I guess I'm asking, does it go down? Right? Does it go from a $10 to $15 million race to a 5 to 10 or 1 to 5? And does the House race go from 5 to 7? Does that functionally change, or does it functionally stay the same?
So I think probably in the aggregate it would go down a little, but there are sufficient other external factors that account for how much gets spent in a race besides the rules. So, for example, Morgan Griffith is going to be reelected. We all know that. It's just going to happen. Chris Obenshain represents a district inside the 9th that is very, very competitive and won't have the same outcome as Morgan Griffith's race. So when you're in a situation like that, Morgan Griffith doesn't have to spend very much money. Chris Obenshain does. So that's not going to change. Competitive seats are competitive seats. Where there's federal overlap with state competitive seats, there might be less in the aggregate, but you still have a lot of pressure to spend. Additionally, you have the complication of competing for the same scarce resources with regard to television and radio advertising. It's a perennial complaint everywhere, not just here, that, the election's coming, it's all politics on TV. It will continue to be all politics on TV. Maybe there'll be more, maybe less, but it'll be different people. And you're all competing for those resources. And to the extent that you can't get enough ad time to meet your objectives, you have to do other things to turn out votes. So which strategies are more expensive and less expensive? Which alternate strategy do you pick? Can you do straight to cable TV instead of just doing broadcast? And there's so many factors that go into that. It's really difficult to know exactly how it would change, and it's hard to find a real comparator that you can say is sufficiently similar that you could predict the outcome.
Yeah, which raises a second question. It's interesting, right? Because if you're Chris Obenshain, if you're Delegate Obenshain, you're going to have to carry the TV advertising to juice turnout in an even year, because your congressman is not going to need to do that work. If you're in the Richmond suburb, your race might become less expensive because you are going to probably have a congressperson that's in a competitive seat that's going to be spending some of that money, right? And that's going to crowd out the pie, which raises the question I don't think we've talked about. We're talking about the federal versus state and that interplay. I mean, do states even splice that out? So like Chris Obenshain's like, I don't want federal limits. I want this to be all state run, because then I can get unlimited amount of money for me. And if I'm tied to Morgan Griffith, that's actually in some ways possibly weighing me down, as opposed to you're in the Richmond suburbs and you're like, well, the more coordination, the better, because we're all one team and yada, yada, yada. Is that even possible to do, to where you see places break out? Does that make sense, the question I'm asking?
So for example, you would just live with the fact that you have federal limits for joint party activities that you're doing in the Richmond area, because there's a sufficient advantage to you with up-ticket races advertising, where in Roanoke you might say, nope, we're not going to do any federal combined activity because I want to spend all my own money. If you wanted to have I wouldn't presume to suggest strategy to anyone. For purposes of an example, if Chris thought there was an advantage to having Morgan in an ad with him, then he would have to be stuck with the federal limits and couldn't just fund it with state money. But yes, there certainly are places that break out that difference to the extent they can when it's to their advantage.
And parties or coordinateds, do parties or coordinateds across the country do that, where they separate out? And then the last question, I guess I'll just ask you the same question I asked John, and Senator Servo put some meat on that bone too. But what do you, if, let's say we implemented it in 2030, we're all on even year elections, like what are the knockoff effects that you would see immediately happen?
Well, very personally, I would have to lay off staff in odd years and hire more staff in even years. I know that's not the principal concern of the committee. It's very difficult to predict how everybody's going to react to different rules. For example, one of the consequences of no limits in Virginia right now is that the caucuses are very independent from the state party. You don't have to rely on the state party for anything except the mail permit, and I don't know how the Democratic Party works it, but on the Republican side, when someone asks us if we would prepare mail on their behalf, we generally say yes, as long as there are funds available, and it's not a strategic matter. So things like that might change. The caucuses might become more integrated or dependent on the state party, and that could be good or bad depending on your perspective. I'm a strong party guy, but I imagine if I were a member of the General Assembly in a caucus, I would think it was really important to have an independent caucus. In terms of the aggregate money in the system, there's nothing that's ever slowed that down. Every year, more money gets spent on politics. So no matter what change we make, it will not have the effect of reducing the total sum of money in the system. In terms of practical changes, again, more compliance professionals like me will get hired. But in terms of political effect, I think that is more about running races simultaneously than it is about any particular rule structure. And I don't think there's a lot you can do on the rule structure to change the difference between a campaign that has everybody on the ballot at once and those that are separate.
Supervisor Schneider?
Thank you. Sorry. So, oh, it went off again. Sorry. So, do you think, again, at local levels, are the elections going to be insulated kind of from the effects, just because they are already more grassroots and, you're locally funded by your constituents, or will we have to be kind of relying on the benevolence of the up-ticket people to, drag us along and help fund us? I just really look at that as, I know the races aren't as expensive, but there are definitely people that spend a lot of money in local things, and I'm not saying they're more successful than others, but I look at that as an issue. So I don't know.
So I think that there's not a universal answer to that. If you're a member of a board of supervisors in Highland County with 4,000 people, it's not going to change your life. You're going to do the same things to turn out the 1,000 of them that are your friends to vote for you. If you're a supervisor in Fairfax County, where your district is 115,000, that's a vague recollection. I think it's somewhere around there. You're running a race that's a lot like a House of Delegates or Senate race, and it's going to be bigger and more expensive, and you're going to have to rely on up-ticket to help you turn out because you simply can't have a relationship with 115,000 people. Where that break point is in terms of size of district, I'm not 100% sure. So I think the effect will vary, but I would anticipate that local candidates, particularly in large jurisdictions, would have less control over their fate in a consolidated election than they do today.
Yeah, thanks. I just had one other question. We periodically have, or I guess annually, have people that introduce legislation to put limits on our state level contributions. Not only limits, but also limit who we can take money from. And those have historically been shot down, most usually in committee. But I'm just curious if were that to happen and we were to align, what the net effect of that would be. Because when I've spoken to other people from other states, they've told me that operate in the state legislative environment, that they have all these limits and they raise this little amount of money, but all the big money goes to these outside groups that ends up running all their campaigns, and they lose complete control over how their campaigns operate because there's all these third parties that end up doing all the activity because they can't because of the limits. And I'm just curious whether this moving from odd to even has any interplay with that, because we can't foresee the future entirely, right?
I think it does make a difference. Right now, there's no incentive for anybody to make an independent expenditure in an odd year. I can either give you the money or I can call you and say, how do you want me to spend this money to most benefit you? And we can just do that for all types of activity, whether it's TV or grassroots or anything else. If you're limited, I can't give you that money or talk to you about it for certain types of expenditures in an odd-numbered year, assuming that there's also a coordination ban in place with the limits. I just assume apply both rules. Then I think that the chances of, particularly in a competitive race, an outside third-party group or a party that wasn't allowed to coordinate fully would wind up spending and doing a lot of it in the district outside the candidate's control. I do want to briefly mention that coordination does not have its ordinary meaning. Coordination doesn't mean you can't coordinate. What's prohibited are coordinated communications. So there's a category of public communications, which is mostly TV, broadcast, big advertising, and you can't coordinate on those activities. You can't coordinate on get out the vote, canvassing, things like that. So people sometimes misunderstand the extent of the coordination rules. Not to say they're not very significant, they are, but there are still some activities that aren't subject to the prohibition on coordinated communications.
Follow up to that real
Thanks.
quick. I assume maybe not, but I assume election lawyers would tell all those groups to form a different organization and put money in it so that you could still coordinate with the state officials and essentially have two organizations working on two separate elections. Would that end up happening?
So if we adopted the source limitations and amount limitations and source prohibitions from federal law, but not the coordination ban, then yes, 100% that would happen.
Delegate Helmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I just wanted to, having listened to both testimonies and understanding the nuances of these pieces, I just want to zoom up for a second. And I think what I'm hearing is that if we were to shift to even year elections, the practical implications would be there were some tactical changes in how we run campaigns. I imagine we didn't specifically speak to this, but to your point about coordination, we would have state house races or state senate races at times that had a what they call a red box, right? A public declaration of, I would really like you to put this on TV for me, which you would have done before by sitting at the table and just telling your partners that, and now you put it on the website. And we would have to think about our accounting in terms of what is a sub $5,000 donation or a sub $3,500 donation and what is not. And in some cases, what is a federally permissible donation in terms of the source of that donation. But in practice, in 45 states, there are state houses and state senates that are at risk of flipping for either party. And there are county boards or town councils that are at risk of flipping for either party that are incredibly important. And in those states, the funding mechanisms to fund those races find a way to get there so that you run effective coordinated campaigns. And in practice, for those of us sitting here, for those who run for elected office now or in the future, the reality would be that you would find a stasis within the rules that would allow you to route effective local or state or federal campaigns within those rules, and the net amount of money would probably be similar to it is today, and what would be different is essentially how you account for how you spend your time and you spend your money and the rules by which you follow. But a supervisor candidate who wants to win in their district, it'll look a little bit different, but they will probably run a effective campaign based on their skills as a candidate and based on following the rules. That looks slightly different than it does to them as a state candidate, but in practice allows them to run an effective campaign. Is that a fair, I'm trying not to be too de minimis about it, but I actually think that is what I'm hearing as a result of the testimony today.
I think as a general proposition, that's true. I think there are cases on the margin that might not be. One of the things that I like about Virginia's political system is it's super easy to run. There's not a high barrier to entry, so anybody can be a candidate. That might be a slight exaggeration, but at the federal level, you're not getting in unless you.
It's how I got here. That's right.
So I think at the margin, you might have people who say, you know what, this thing is just way too complicated. My brother-in-law, the accountant, can't figure it out. There's no way I can. I'm not going to do it. Whether that's the most pressing concern in your decisions, I don't know. But that's the only case I can see from your example where I think that would be a significant difference that the reality that politicians adapt to the environment they're in would not overcome.
Mr. Chair, even though on issues like ballot access, right? I mean, we're not fundamentally saying that you need more signatures or anything. I mean, even on that level, it's still gonna be relatively easy to access the
I agree with you regards to ballot access not changing. I guess I would compare it, and when I tell candidates this, when they hire me, they kind of freak out. So you're entering a regulated industry. You're a small business and you're entering a highly regulated industry, and that's a pain. There's a lot of stuff you have to comply with. I don't have that conversation with state candidates nearly as often as I have it with federal candidates, simply because the regulations are just not that difficult to deal with. But by and large, I would agree.
And to follow on to that, essentially, assuming we didn't change much about that from a state perspective, the only increased regulatory burden would be to the extent that you as a candidate wanted to integrate within a federal election cycle. And reality is most of the time that wouldn't be you, right? Like, unless I guess you're paying for your own TV ad and you want Mark Warner or Morgan Griffith in it, right? Which I think functionally most candidates don't want that anyway. No offense to either one of them. They're great people. But, right, I mean, but otherwise, if you're talking about coordinated campaigns, if you're talking about mail issues, you're really talking about the state party evolving and having to change, or the caucuses maybe, more than you're talking about an individual candidate who's probably not raising more than the federal max donation anyway most of the time, right?
I think that's fair. The only question I would have is whether the cost of a local campaign goes up simply because of the competition with the other races on the ballot, and that's difficult to predict.
Delegate Olivia Bowling?
Thank you. Maybe it's on. Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, a question for our presenter. I'm wondering, because I'm new to this, right, and I'm trying to understand it all, how is this going to affect elected officials here, specifically in the General Assembly, who may be looking at a June primary and fundraising during General Assembly session, since what I'm hearing, there can be a separation of raising federal dollars and not, so maybe if I'm tag teaming with a federal candidate during January, February, March, am I able to raise, not raise? Am I able to campaign or not? How do you know how that's going to be affected?
So when a member of the General Assembly seeks federal office during session, they raise federal funds because the prohibition only applies to state funds. So if you were working on a coordinated program to use the state party to finance some of your efforts, I suppose theoretically during the General Assembly session, you could raise money into the state party federal account. Y'all might want to take a look at that. I kind of regret that I raised it, but I think that answers the question.
I think that's it. Chris, thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Really appreciate you doing this. Want to just shout out to Delegate Bloxham and David Levy. We're online, so thank you guys for being online. Our next meeting is August 20th. I think, Brooks, is that the one that's about funding or the one that's about admin? I can't remember off the top of my head.
I believe that's the one about the budget and then funding, yeah.
Okay, so on the 20th, we're going to be talking to Senate Finance, House of Propes, the registrars, Department of Elections, and we're going to be talking about money and how election administration and funding works.
How much money we'd save?
We're not going to prejudice the testimony, Senator Somerville. Delegate Price.
Yeah, I just, I know that our other meeting got some folks interested and there was some news generated on that. I do just kind of want to give a caveat to folks that might be watching, and maybe there's an additional presentation that we might have at a future meeting. Most of our conversation today was from an elected official perspective, a candidate perspective for compliance. I think there's also another side of this conversation that would be transparency for the public to know what it is that we're doing, or impact on, I think we touched on it a little bit 2 days ago, but like, how would this impact the voters? And I think that we just need to bring that back to the forefront in some of our conversations, and looking forward to hearing more on that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's to come for sure. Anybody else for the good of the order? Public comment. Oh, we have to do public comment. Is there anybody online? And is there anybody that wants to come forward? Thank you for the reminder. All right, well, with that, we will adjourn. Thank you, everybody.
This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.